Good evening, one and all. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy, and I'm thrilled to have you all here for tonight's lecture, Abstract Expressionism, Who's in the Picture, which will be delivered by Adam Weinberg, this semester's American Academy Presidential Fellow. And let me just pause to say it is so great to have a house full of art people and art-loving people and art-connected people, and even artists, so that's terrific. So those of you who know the Academy are familiar with our tradition, not unique to us, of naming fellowships after people who've been very important to the Academy and in more than a few cases very generous to the Academy. Now you may be wondering, what is a presidential fellow? Well, I can attest that that is also named after someone who is very important to the Academy, at least fleetingly, and that is me. The president of the American Academy, I want to emphasize fleetingly, the president of the American Academy has the option granted to him by our board, nothing illegitimate about this, to invite outstanding personalities from the world of U.S. culture, from the Academy, from politics, or the arts as a presidential fellow. And I have used this extraordinary power to extend the invitation to Adam, hoping that he and his wife, Lorraine, might somehow be enticed to join us here on the Wannsee. And we were fortunate that this offer was timed well with the end of his remarkable 20-year tenure at the Whitney. So it is a thrill to have Adam Weinberg as this year's presidential fellow. Now, Adam asked me to be brief in the introduction, I think out of his sort of congenital humility, and so I'm going to go on at some length. Adam Weinberg served as the Alice Pratt Brown Director of the Whitney Museum of American Art from 2003 to 2023. And that alone is quite extraordinary for one person to run one of America's foremost cultural institutions in this time of perpetual contention. It's really a remarkable achievement. And during his time at the Whitney, Adam oversaw the museum's move in 2015 from the Breuer Building on Madison Avenue to its fabulous new Renzo Piano building in the Meatpacking District overlooking the Hudson River. And here I won't make that comment comparing the Renzo Piano building there and the one in Potsdamer Platz. But the Whitney's annual attendance under Adam's direction tripled to 1.2 million before the pandemic. Membership in the museum rose more than fourfold to 50,000, and Adam brought nearly 4,000 works into the Whitney's collection. And let me say with particular admiration that the endowment increased more than tenfold to more than 400 million. Astonishingly, Adam has overseen more than 300 exhibitions, including 9 editions of the Whitney's signature biennial. You do say biennial, not biennial. Okay, I just want to make sure I got that right. And major installations of the permanent collection, including the inaugural downtown exhibition, America's Hard to See, and the mega show, Edward Hopper's New York. In the fall of 2023, he stepped down as Whitney director, but he remains director emeritus and the institution's honorary trustee. Now, Adam has done a lot of other things at a variety of other institutions, including the Addison Gallery of American Art at Andover, the American Center in Paris, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. He's on the board of the American Academy at Rome, which we forgive him for, and any number of other institutions. And he has more awards than one could mention here in detail and get out on time. But what amazes me most about Adam is that he has done all these things, and he has run this big institution for 2 decades, and he's just so happy. He is ebullient. He is upbeat. How does that happen? Maybe he feels liberated now, but I feel like I've known him for a few years, and he seemed the same before. Lorraine, can you help me here? Can you explain this? Where's Lorraine? Yeah, maybe, well, that was my other thought. That's the next line. It says, maybe it's Lorraine. Anyway, it's not just the happiness, it's the generosity in terms of time and advice and warmth and all the rest. And it is, to me, all the more remarkable because Adam and I grew up about 30 miles apart from each other, and I am dying to know what they put in the water in Westchester that they didn't in Fairfield County. Undoubtedly, part of Adam's ebullience is his love for the art itself and for making the experience of great art available to so many people, and that truly is a great accomplishment. So Adam is here in Berlin as a fellow at the Academy, and he's working on a new monograph about contemporary artists and the creation of sacred spaces. And we are looking forward to hearing more about that at some point in the near future. But tonight he is addressing the topic of abstract expressionism. And before I give it over to Adam, I just want to mention a few quick housekeeping details. Adam will speak for about 35 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A with the audience. If you're here at the Academy, you know how to deal with Q&A. Just wait for the microphone to get to you. If you're on the Zoom, please type your question into the Q&A part of the Zoom platform. And now, without any further palaver, comments, criticisms, whatever, Adam, it's all yours.
I have to say that really was the best introduction, and I'm really not as happy as you think. Ask Lorraine; she can tell you. She's sitting in the back so that she would protect it. But Dan, first of all, thank you so much for the comments, and thank you for letting me be a presidential appointee. It really was hard to convince me. We had lunch. He said, "Why don't you come sometime?" I said, "Sure, I'm on. When do you want me?" So I was going to say that was about how hard the convincing took, and I have to say, I am loving it, and I'm not just taking happy pills. I really love it here, but I have to say I can't think of a better place to have a reset after a 40-something year museum career. Both in terms of renewing my connection to art, which just feels, I know it's hard to believe in a museum, you don't have as much to do with it as you think. But I have to say that Lorraine and I are just really thrilled to be here. I just want to say I love my new Academy family of fellows, the fellow families who are here, and the entire staff of the Academy. And I want to thank you for your camaraderie, your collegiality, and most importantly, your sense of humor, because, you know, when you get up early in the morning and you see the same people at the table, you need to be able to laugh, especially when I look the way I do. I mean, but also tonight, I'm a little serious, but I just want to say I want to dedicate my talk this evening to Lee Rayford, who is one of our esteemed fellows, who could not be here because of the untimely passing of her father. So this little gesture, I hope, may assuage a little bit of the pain she's going through. This evening, I will not discuss my current research on contemporary artist chapels and sacred spaces. You'll have to come back and pray that I do it next time, which is still in early stages and some ways actually an outgrowth of my work on mid-century American art. Tonight, I'll talk about abstract expressionism, which is taken to be the first major international art movement stemming from America, which for me, as a longtime director and curator of American art, has been a preoccupying subject. Abstract expressionism is still taken to be a defining cultural moment in American cultural life, even though it's weird, the term actually originates outside the United States, and it came from Germany. So that's the German connection here, and that's about it. But as such, this term sets the expectations, the labels, the stereotypes for successive generations of artists. And these labels, which often take pictorial and symbolic form, need to be continually interrogated. So we begin. Okay, lots of pictures to keep you wide awake, of course, and you have to forgive me because I get a little discombobulated with pushing buttons, and I'm technically not very good, but I promise we will get through in at least 1 hour and 25 minutes. See, that's what he... No worries. So, who's in the picture? Certain photographs achieve iconic status, defining a time, a place, an event, a person, or a group of people. Metaphorically speaking, they are vortices, black holes of sorts, images that have a way of devouring other meanings, making other images or of similar subjects subservient. In the years leading up to and after the Second World War, New York City was becoming icon central, the place that exemplified the modern, the place where the future was being made. So it was in post-war world of art. The title of Serge Guilbeault's essential book of 1983 said it all: How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art. Certain images define the art world and art history, arguably as much as the art itself. The article on the left anointed Pollock as the greatest living painter in the United States, even as it asked the question and poked fun by saying, "Finally, after days of brutling and doodling, Pollock decides the painting is finished, a deduction few others are equipped to make." The Hans Namath image on the right was one of a series of iconic images that defined the new generation of hard-charging, macho, rough-and-tumble artists who visually explicated the term action painting that was to be coined 2 years later by the art critic Harold Rosenberg. 6 months after the Life magazine article on Pollock, this photograph, one of the most iconic art world images ever made, was like a lightning bolt. It instantly made famous and defined a glance for generations of the central practitioners of abstract expressionism. Here they are, the irascibles. Count them, 14 men and 1 woman. Actually, there were 18 irascibles who were protesting the Metropolitan Museum of Art's American Painting Today. But only 15 people could make it for the shoot at the studio on 44th Street. Indeed, artists such as Franz Klein, Jacques Tworkov, Philip Guston did not even sign the irascibles letter. Okay, as a reminder, here's who's in the picture, and I'm going to do this really fast, so you have to look really hard, okay? Starts with, who else? Jackson Pollock. Willem de Kooning. Adolf Gottlieb. Barnett Newman. Just in case you can't read. Clifford Still. Mark Rothko. Robert Motherwell. Ad Reinhardt. Richard Pousset Dart. William Baziotes. Bradley Walker Tomlin. Theodore Stamos. James Brooks. Jimmy Ernst, son of Max Ernst. Hedda Sterne. And that's it. The Irascibles, a moniker given to these artists by critic Emily Genauer of the Herald Tribune, was made by a significant photographer who today is known by only a few. Nina Lean grew up in Europe, studied in Berlin, and came to the U.S. in 1930. She produced over 50 covers for Life magazine and had a career extending over 4 decades. But for the most part, she would be remembered for making a single image. Lean, who despite her regular assignments for Life was never given a staff position, interestingly enough, she was an all-purpose stringer, best known for her anecdotal photographs of celebrities, fashion models, and animals. The 15 artists in the picture were allowed to arrange themselves before the camera of Lean, not wanting to look like bankers, they said. They had refused to be photographed on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art itself, as if they might appear to have been rejected from the great temple of art. They were savvy about the power of photographs. They were reluctant subjects. They were defiant, petulant, self-assured, irascible. They were well-dressed, shoes shined, all wore ties except Pollock, whose body was turned away from the camera, and 4 of the painters hold cigarettes, signifying their masculine cool. As Lean said, I think they loved having their pictures taken, but they seemed to be afraid to be nice. They didn't want to appear too commercial. Lean had made 12 exposures during the shoot. This was the one the magazine selected to be published with a short text below. All are representatives of advanced art. They paint in styles which vary from the dribblings of Pollock to the Cyclopean phantoms of Baziotes. Yes, they were white guys, Americans ranging in age from 28 to 51. They weren't, however, an entirely homogeneous group. 4 were immigrants, Rothko, de Kooning, Sterne, and Ernst, and 4, Baziote, Stamos, Reinhardt, and Gottlieb, were offspring of immigrant parents, Greek, German, and Czech, bringing with them memories and images from the places and time past. They were not a school nor of one mind, although most were members of the Club, the downtown forum for contemporary art formed in 1949. What they shared was a belief in art that was forward-looking, progressive, and addressed the unknown. This image rapidly achieved iconic status. It soon determined who was an abstract expressionist, who was in the picture, and who was out. Indeed, the 3 irascible artists who were unable to make the session, they have largely been consigned to secondary status as abstract expressionists. How many of you have heard of Franz Bultmann? Some of you know of Hans Hofmann. On the other hand, Hans Hofmann is primarily known as a teacher, and Weldon Keys, which most of you I'm sure haven't heard of, and I didn't either until I started doing the research. As Barnett Newman wrote in 1948, we are in the process of making the world to a certain extent in our own image. But I would ask, whose image was ours? Abstract expressionism, which largely came to be defined by the practitioners in this photograph, was the first international style to originate in the U.S., and while these practitioners were at first ridiculed, they soon reigned supreme over an exclusive new academy. For the artists, the photograph was an unintended, even unwanted manifesto, as was the term abstract expressionist itself, also disavowed by many of them. The press had won out. The photograph defined them. Even tough, many of the artists resisted definition. Little did these painters, specialists in images themselves, imagine that this studio photograph would raise a picture from the quotidian to the canonical. And for anybody who went to see the recent Mark Rothko retrospective that was in the LVMH in Paris, one of the great Rothko retrospectives, one of the first photographs you see when you walk in the room, that's the one. The same picture, which is amazing that that's what is defining it today. So, here we go. The irascible's image has been celebrated, mimicked, mocked, and undermined. The photograph on the left, painted by the gay artist Keith Meyerson in an anecdotal, figurative manner, is a painting the abstract expressionists themselves would have detested. The photograph on the right by Vic Muniz was made from dripped and poured chocolate syrup. And this pair of images, excuse me, stuck page here. This pair of images is a series using the irascibles as its inspiration. All of these works, in effect, variously confirm, extend, question, or undermine the status of the image. In this talk, I want to address several exemplars of those who were out of the picture and one individual who was in. Hedda Sterne, the sole woman in the irascibles group, said, "It was the worst thing that ever happened to me." She later remarked about the other artists that they were all very furious that I was in at all because they were sufficiently macho to think that the presence of a woman took away from the seriousness of it all. Pretty depressing. Hedda Sterne was indeed late to come to the session and was asked at the last minute to stand on a table in the back, towering apart and hovering above the others, darkly dressed with a spectral shadow behind her that looks as if it could have been a hatted male. As she said, people think, look, you're on top of it all. But I could say, I'm behind them all. Hedda Sterne's work stood apart from the other artists as much as each artist had their own distinct personal styles. As Sterne wrote, in my generation, art was seen as a great act of freedom and independence. That was the only thing that united this group. Sterne, a Jewish Romanian-born artist, lived and worked in Europe until 1941, when she came to the United States. Her greatest influence was the work of the Dada and Surrealist artists studying with practitioners such as Victor Bronner in Bucharest. Upon her arrival, she fell into the circle of Peggy Guggenheim, with whom she had exhibited in London. She got to know André Breton, Marcel Duchamp, Max Ernst, all of whom were then in exile in New York. Peggy Guggenheim included Sterne in 2 exhibitions at her legendary gallery called Art of the Century, and both of the shows were devoted to women artists, 31 Women and The Women. By 1944, Sterne had her first solo exhibition at Wakefield Gallery with the celebrated dealer Betty Parsons, who would later show in Parsons' own gallery, where she exhibited other would-be irascibles such as Gottlieb, Stamos, Pollock, Rothko, and Still. Throughout the 40s, Sterne's work was comprised of dreamlike, constructed, and constructivist images and architectural settings inhabited by automata, often painted in pastel colors and earth tones. Her work shared some of the surrealist spirit, as well as an inventive use of drawn and painted forms of those, particularly by fellow immigrant artist Jimmy Ernst, and the soft and fuzzy palette tones used by Basiotes, whose work she greatly admired. Interesting, because the two that she admired most were the ones who were really on the fringes of the group. Hedda Sterne's breakthrough in the early period were her fresh, aggressive, boldly brushed and spray-painted images that are totally abstract yet referential. As she said, when I took a trip through the U.S. by car, I got involved in painting highways from 1951 to 1957. In order to show the feeling I had of cars moving at high speed and blurring, I used to spray paint, which is a speedy way of working. You know, there are certain subjects that suggest the technique to do them in. Those highway subjects suggested spray. These muscular spray-painted works are among the most forward-looking paintings, I would contend, to come out of mid-century abstract expressionism. Aha. Let me get a sip here. You can stare at Lee. Lee Krasner. Lee Krasner always thought that the reason Hedda Sterne was included in the Irascible's photograph and not herself was that she showed with the Petty Parsons Gallery, and Krasner did not. Krasner had the right to be bitter, not at Sterne, but in an art system that largely excluded women artists from the galleries and museums, and as a result, the histories of art. Krasner, who married Jackson Pollock in 1945, was at the time of the Irascible photograph known legally as Mrs. Jackson Pollock. This photograph captures the hierarchical relationship between Pollock and Krasner as she plays audience to his performance. Krasner already had a significant career and body of work behind her well before she met Pollock, in fact. And if anything, Krasner was a bit of a teacher to Pollock. She had studied with Hans Hofmann and was making thickly painted, colorful abstract paintings using Cubist-inspired structures. In the early 1940s, she became involved with a group called the American Abstract Artists Group, and it was mostly influenced by Mondrian. Though it was a forerunner to abstract expressionism, the members of this group tended to be more interested in compositional structures and hard-edged forms derived from European extraction, while Krasner was associated with the U.S. government-sponsored Work Projects Administration that was talked about in a previous lecture by one of our fellows over there, Jim. And actually, a lot of these artists were associated with the WPA and the Fine Art Project mural program. She never had the opportunity to produce a mural of her own, and almost every single one of the other abstract artists did. And instead, she was given the responsibility of overseeing window displays with the war effort produced by male artists such as Pollock. Lee Krasner, by the late 1940s, lost interest in hard-edge painting and began a series of geometrically derived little image paintings and made use of the upstairs tiny bedroom of their farmhouse in the Springs on Long Island, befitting her subservient role as Pollock's wife, while Pollock used the much larger backyard studio. These all-over, heavily impastoed works, composed edge-to-edge, suggest cellular cloisonné enamels, and they variously range from these multicolored, wonderful kaleidoscopic works to the black and white images. Many suggest Hebrew letterings that she practiced as a child, and some others actually have suggestions really of kind of fake hieroglyphics. Even before Pollock died in a drunken car crash in 1956, Krasner's work became restlessly larger. The forms became increasingly bold, explosive, and colorful. These paintings, teeming with pent-up energy, were vertical and seemed as if they barely could contain the elements within. After Pollock's demise, she took over his studio, good for her, and began to paint with the power and on a scale previously denied. And actually, Lorraine and I were just recently in the studio, and if you've ever been to the Pollock studio, you can go to it on Long Island. You should go because the floor is magnificent, and you wonder, how did that floor get preserved? When she moved into the studio, she put wood all over the floor, and they actually totally had forgotten, and they picked it up later, and then you could see actually where all the paintings that Pollock painted during that period were painted, which is quite amazing. After the death of Pollock, Lee Krasner said, "The question came up whether one could continue painting at all. I guess this was my answer. This painting, The Seasons, was a panoramic size. In fact, larger than actually most of the paintings that Pollock had ever done. And it gave her the chance not to paint merely plants, but the feeling of the landscape and the woodlands around her. The painting opened up with abandon and became expressive and expansive with a palette unlike that of any other abstract expressionist. This 17-foot-long work, The Mural She Never Painted, was part of a group of paintings of the late 1950s that were called the Earth Green series. They made use of rounded, feminine forms that are nowhere else to be seen in the Irascibles. Norman Lewis. Of all the artists of the period, Norman Lewis should have been in the picture. Lewis was born smack in the middle of the first-generation abstract expressionists, at the same time as Pollock, de Kooning, Baziotis, and Sterne. Moreover, Lewis was not geographically distant from the movement. He was born and raised in Harlem, and he learned art and design in an industrial high school, which kindled his enduring commitment to painting. In his 20s, Lewis studied with African-American sculptor and teacher, the famous Augusta Savage, and then briefly with Raphael Sawyer, and eventually with the celebrated black painter Charles Alston, who was the first black supervisor of the fine arts program of the WPA. One could see the influence of socially conscious realism in Lewis's down-and-out subjects, such as the snow, and this is an early piece, such as the snow-encrusted The Wanderer. Through Alston, Lewis meets many of the leading lights of the period, from artists Jacob Lawrence and Romare Bearden, writers such as Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright, to downtown denizens of the art world such as Orson Welles and Benny Goodman. In 1934, Lewis joined the Federal Art Project and served as a teacher and printed lithographs for artists such as Lee Krasner. His growing interest in formal structure and tension between subject and style can be discerned in Girl with Yellow Hat of a few years later. In 1935, Lewis visited MoMA in New York, where he made pastels of the historic exhibition African Negro Art. Lewis abhorred the expression primitive art, commonly used to describe indigenous African art. For him, this denigrating term suggested an idea of crudeness and incompetence, while, as he said, its primary concern is with the elemental, and its simplicity comes from strong and direct feeling, a quality he prized in his own art. In this period, Lewis became interested in Mexican mural painting, Asian scrolls, screens, as well as Native American art, and he began to make brilliantly composed, accomplished abstractions in the spirit of European moderns such as Kandinsky. But simultaneously, he continued to work with social realist and political satire. From 1945, Lewis was considered by art historians to be an abstract expressionist, although his pictures still did not appear in any of these. He had exhibited in groups with artists. Actually, his first full-scale retrospective was only about 8 years ago in Philadelphia, which is unbelievably shocking. He had exhibited in group shows with artists such as de Kooning. In 1949, he participated in meetings of the subjects of the artist school, an informal discussion group formed by Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, and William Baziotes. At this time, he also met Pollock, Still, and Reinhardt. While he was not a signatory to the Irascibles letter, he was very much in the mix. Works such as Roller Coaster and on the left and Untitled reveal for all over decentered composition, spontaneous calligraphic inscription, synesthetic experience, and attention to the frame of the image. Roller Coaster has hidden figures within, and the untitled work there is a sense of concealed subject lurking, a subject he constantly worked with, the idea of lurking. Indeed, not being an absolutist, Lewis toggled back and forth between completely abstract and figurative works throughout his career. Lewis made black paintings like the previous untitled work with flashes of brilliant color in the 40s, light emerging from the darkness. But he also began painting monochrome, first white paintings in the 1950s. However, his canvases, like Every Atom Glows and Blending, are some of his most radical works, and actually some of my favorite works made during this entire period. The enveloping darkness, the deft painting of the smudged and blurry chains of forms and indeterminate spaces leaves viewers in nowhere land, hanging out in a mist, an almost mystical space. Indeed, Lewis was deeply interested in Zen Buddhism. Every Atom Glows is taken to be a comment on the growing fears of the nuclear age after World War II. As one author states, this title, like much of his work, is a dualistic poetic political reference, ambiguously referencing both form and content, language and structure, the microscopic and the macroscopic. And the title itself is actually a quote taken from American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote, "Self-kindled, every atom glows and hints the future to which it owes." For all his connections to and affinities with the irascibles, Lewis was not in the picture. He was a black man on the fringe, even though he was in the center. His art often echoed social concerns, although, as he poignantly wrote, reaffirming the spirit of abstract expressionist artists, "For many years, I struggled to express social conflict," and he did paintings that actually were about social protest. But he said, "Through my painting, however gradually, I came to realize that certain things are true. The development of one's aesthetic abilities suffers by such an emphasis, and the content of truly creative work must be inherently aesthetic," which is a pretty remarkable statement for somebody who was really cast aside and constantly being ignored. Philip Guston. If any artist would have been expected to be in the picture, it was Philip Guston. Guston well knew the artists in the picture. He exhibited with them. He was in the club discussion group. He drank with them at the Cedar Tavern. He exhibited with them in museum and gallery shows. Guston, however, rejected the term abstract expressionist and later on said wryly, "What do they think, that we're all on the same baseball team?" As art historian David Anfam wrote some years ago in the catalog Pollock and the Irascibles, perhaps the outstanding feature of the movement is a deep concern with the search for self. This preoccupation befit all the Irascibles, and notably one who did not sign the Irascible protest letter, Philip Guston, born Philip Goldstein in Montreal, Canada, and the son of Ukrainian Jews. Guston grew up in L.A., where he attended the Manual Arts High School, and he befriended Jackson Pollock. They were actually quite a mischievous pair. In fact, they were both expelled from high school for publishing leaflets and satirizing faculty and criticizing sports. Pollock returned to the high school, but Guston never did. But he did go on to art school, the Otis Art Institute, and became familiar with Renaissance masters such as Paolo Uccello, Piero della Francesca, Mantegna, as well as surreal and metaphysical landscapes by artists such as Giorgio de Chirico. He went to work with one of the great Marxist Mexican muralists, David Alfaro Siqueiros, in Mexico in 1934. And throughout the 1930s and 40s, Guston's art was figuratively based, ranging from direct political statements, fully engaged in subjects from fascism to racism, to more personal existential allegories in the 40s, such as "If This Not Be I" on the left and "Porch Number 2" on the right. As the artist wrote, "Eventually erasure becomes very real to me. Very much on the subject, it could be even a deciding element. If this be not I, an early masterpiece painting, and the more radical modernist all-over composition of Porch Number 2 are haunting and pessimistic and personal, figures are obscured, covered, buried, turned away. Only the little girl, Guston's young daughter, is fully visible, suggesting a glimmer of hopefulness. The porch is a rather somber painting. On the right, a rope leading down to the head of a man is likely a reference to Guston's father, who hung himself, and who the artist himself discovered when he was 10 years old." Following suit on the idea of erasure, the tormentors of 1947-48 and red painting of 1950 may be taken as steps towards the obliteration and disappearance of self. Tormentors indeed a step further in removing all of the subjects. As one art historian wrote, "The painting has been marked by spectral abstract presences, the fragile white lines stitched into the dark ground hints of the missing figures. Evil and conflict are projected through undefined forms and abstract presences." In red painting, the subject is just that, a red painting. Figures are gone, the thickly applied oil is presence unto itself, and the presence of the artist making the work, It is art in real time, of his present time, of his subjective emotional state. Darkness remains in patches of black in predominantly burning scumbled fields of fiery red. In the 1950s, the work remains abstract for a decade. Colors are by turns delicately and heavy-handedly composed. They are carefully constructed, scintillating forms of fields of color. The artist has been erased, yet the artist is very much present. While it seems Guston has fully enjoined abstract expressionism, he's not so much embraced it, but surrendered to it. The allegorical battles in the paintings of the 40s have been lost. His commitment to abstraction is, in fact, to his mind, surrender. By 1957, Guston has remarked that the loss of subject is disastrous. By the 1960s, Guston is in a new place, as the title of the painting on the left suggests. He wrote, "Doubt itself becomes form." And Guston made it clear that he doubted the entire project of abstract expressionists. He was more irascible than any of the irascibles. For Guston, subject and politics were essential. Guston buried abstract expressionism in 1960 when he wrote, "There is something ridiculous and miserly in the myth we inherit from a strict art, that painting is autonomous, pure, and for itself, and therefore we habitually define its ingredients and define its limits. But painting is impure. It is the adjustment of impurities which forces painting's continuity. We are image makers and image ridden." Sounds like it could have been written yesterday. The majority of the irascibles were born in the first decade of the 20th century. There were a couple of relative youngsters, Richard Pousset Dart, born in 1916, and Theodore Stamos, born in 22. In all, there was roughly a 30-year spread between the firstborn and the last. What was the cutoff age? Did it apply differently to men and women like Joan Mitchell and Helen Frankenthaler? Helen Frankenthaler, born in 1928, the girlfriend of critic Clement Greenberg, the champion of the abstract expressionist artists. You have to wonder whether that was really a handicap. And then the wife, interestingly enough, of irascible Robert Motherwell, was herself painting relevant, rigorous abstract expressionist works by 1950, the exact same time. She was born in 1928. And Joan Mitchell, several years older than Frankenthaler, was also making full-fledged, bold, abstract works by 1950s. Artists such as Mitchell and Frankenthaler were irrevocably deemed second-generation abstract expressionists. And so it's Helen Frankenthaler on the left and Joan Mitchell on the right, a term which could until recently be implied secondary importance. But their greatest handicap to being in the picture was that they were women. Joan Mitchell grew up in a privileged family in Chicago, studied first at Smith College and subsequently at the Art Institute of Chicago. Her elevated socioeconomic status may have been another factor in her quest to be taken seriously as an artist. Mitchell spent a couple of years on a European fellowship, moved to New York in 1950, where she joined the community of downtown painters such as Klein and de Kooning. And Mitchell actually participated in the lectures at the club, which was the hangout of the abstract expressionists, and she went and drank with the toughest of them at the Cedar Bar and continued to do so when she moved to France. According to Katie Siegel, who just curated an important Mitchell retrospective in the U.S., she went to their studios and shows, and they came to hers. She had dinner and drinks with them in company and alone, talking painting, material, and great art. Mitchell also participated in the celebrated 9th Street show curated by Leo Castelli, which also included Pollock and de Kooning. Yet she was no stranger to their crowd. Sadly, however, Mitchell said, "I had it easier because I never thought I could be in the major competition, being a female." The relatively tender painting on the left, Rose Cottage, is named for the house she rented with other second-generation artists in the Hamptons. Here we find evidence of her painting en plein air, taking direct inspiration from the landscape, not unlike Krasner. In her painting Hemlock, one could see and feel loose, rhythmical quality of nature-derived subjects. However, her paintings were not intended as transcriptions of nature. As she said, "I paint from remembered landscapes that I carry with me, and remembered feelings of them, which of course become transformed." As she also remarked, "My paintings aren't about art issues. They're about feelings that come to me from the outside landscape. It's not about me." This, too, may have been a dividing factor from her male counterparts. She believed the inspirations to derive from the exterior, while many of her male counterparts believed it began and ended with themselves. Think Jackson Pollock's most famous quote when asked by Hans Hofmann if he worked from nature. You know what he replied? "I am nature." Modest. Mitchell's paintings made in New York run the gamut. The bold, edgy urban painting on the left, Evenings on 72nd Street, in 1956, squarely challenges de Kooning's aggressive mid-decade paintings and reflects her often commented on tempestuous character. Mitchell, like de Kooning, often became frustrated with the all-over edge-to-edge composition that characterized much of the abstract expressionist painting. Her painting, Hudson River Dayline, in contrast, is an early experiment with a more centralized composition and the introduction of one of her long preferred colors, blue, cobalt blue, absolutely gorgeous, something that is the delight of every one of her paintings. By the second half of the 1950s, Mitchell was spending more and more time in France, and in 1959, she moved to Paris. Mitchell said that she relocated to Paris for personal reasons. That is, that she fell in love with French-Canadian artist Jean-Paul Riopelle. However, being abroad enabled her to have an identity not primarily determined by the New York art world and the men of abstract expressionism, even though she maintained a presence there and went regularly back and forth. One last one, Ed Clark. Ed Clark was by no stretch of the imagination in the picture. Clark, born in Louisiana, moved to Chicago as a youngster until as a teen he enlisted in the armed forces. Returning to Chicago in 1946, he enrolled at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where Joan Mitchell was also in attendance. Though they didn't know one another at the time, years later in France. Oh, that's okay. I thought maybe I was supposed to do something, but anyway.
I do something.
Okay, very good. No problem. Excuse me. Sense of humor, remember? Sense of humor. Returning to Chicago in 1946, he enrolled at the School of the Art Institute, where Joan Mitchell was also in attendance. Though they didn't know one another at the time, years later in France, they became close friends, and actually really close friends. They really relied on each other and talked art constantly with one another. And in fact, in the 1960s, she gave him use of a studio on her property. Really wonderful artist relationship. No doubt being Abbeck's artist was a bond. Clark would not have yet been known to the New York art world in 1950. Indeed, it is only in recent years that he has become known to a wider and whiter art world, largely actually through the artist David Hammonds, who was his great friend and great champion. Ed Clark, let's see, oh, here we go. Ed Clark couldn't have been in the picture because in 1952, he was studying at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, the school where artists in the picture like Adolph Gottlieb and Bradley Walker Tomlin had studied and composed works in Cubist-derived compositions. Clark was an artist in a hurry, a man who sensed his time and wanted to be a part of it. The present, not the past. Only a year or two before, Clark was making paintings in a figurative tradition. Clark was on his way to a breakthrough, as you could see in this painting, The City. His compositions were becoming more spontaneous, more abstract, and not tied to observable subjects. This early masterpiece was composed edge to edge with syncopated forms, his differing attention to the left edge anchored in darkness and the right edge anchored in bright colors made for an unexpected dramatic structure. And like Pollock, he worked on this painting on the floor so that he could control the spread, the thickly applied enamels which then characterize his art. Yet this connection of painting to the floor would have further implication for Clark's work in a few years. Within a short time, Clark was experimenting alternatively with loose, brushy applications of paint, like the French abstract painter Nicolas de Stael, who he greatly admired, as well as hard-edged, irregular, collage-like forms composed and interconnected by transparent veils of color. In 1957, Clark made this breakthrough painting, Untitled, which is in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago and is now largely recognized as the first ever irregular-shaped painting. This radical work was made with paper, wood planking, as well as stretchers and canvas. He was no longer painting shapes. He was constructing literal painted shapes. At this time, Clark also began to recognize that working on the floor had other artistic benefits. Increasingly, he wanted to make larger sweeping strokes, but was limited by the size of the brushes available. So, as Clark said, in 1956, I got into using a broom, which actually de Stael had used it around the same time, or what I like to call the big sweep. I wanted to cover a large area, something you cannot do with your wrist. The straight stroke with a push broom gives you speed, cutting through everything. And actually, one of the things I think that most characterizes abstract expressionism is how each artist used their hand, their wrist, their arm, and their entire body. I mean, it's a wonderful choreography and study in choreography, and someday somebody will get films of each of these people painting. That would be fantastic. Anyway, with this work, Clark stepped out in front of abstract expressionists who are always constrained by the rectangular structure and the hand of the artist. His works anticipated the experiments of artists like Frank Stella. In short order, Clark's painting was being recognized abroad by the esteemed French critic Michel Souffort, who in his Dictionary of Abstract Painters included Clark along with Pollock and de Kooning. As one supporter of the work wrote in the 1980s, as an American of African background, Clark could perhaps undertake a journey with better maps and fewer encumbrances than his European contemporaries. Clark himself said, "Over there, rejection had nothing to do with being black. I was viewed as an American. It wasn't about race. It was about one culture saying that another culture wasn't up to snuff." Clark went to New York in 1957. He was a founding member of the Brada Gallery, which was one of the key downtown 10th Street cooperative galleries that were home to many first and second generation abstract expressionists, many of whom were in the picture and many of whom were out, as well as the burgeoning generation of pop artists who would edge all of them out in the end. An artist such as Clark points to the limitations of a picture such as the Irascibles, which came to define the abstract expressionist movement for so many years. It was a point in time. Some missed the picture by chance, others by choice. One artist wasn't sure she wanted to be in the picture, and yet others were indiscriminately ignored, and others, like Clark, arrived a moment too late, and when he did arrive, most did not even see him. As Clark said in an interview in 1997, the art establishment paid me no attention. They assumed the whole abstract expressionist movement and anything related to it was inhabited only by white painters. They thought black painters should paint their own people, like Bearden and Jacob Lawrence. An artist, abstract artist like Norman Lewis, was ignored even though he hung out with Rothko, de Kooning, and lots of the others. I took strength from my experiences in Paris, where it wasn't racial. But I realized that in America, you do get into that. I remember that Algernon Miller, the father of Afrofuturist art, said that the arena of high painting is the last area of racial superiority. In the mid-50s, Clark was thinking bigger. I have always had a thing about painting, huge pictures, and this might be because I am small in stature, said Clark. They call it trying to be the bull. Or trying to make up for it. In recent years, museums are trying to make up for it, to remedy their long-held prejudices, their deliberate and willful ignorance, as we can see in this picture of Clark's painting, acquired by the Whitney Museum only 5 years ago, where it now takes its rightful place in the permanent collection galleries, along with works by Norman Lewis, Joan Mitchell, and many, many others who were not in the picture. Thank you very much. Thank you. Am I supposed to take questions? Is that okay? I thought this was a good one to end on. Any questions? If not, we can go and have something to eat and drink. One? Yes, over there. Oh, it's a plant from inside.
Dan made me do this. Hi, I'm RJ. I work at the American Academy. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit to the audience how powerful this Clement Greenberg's logic was on abstract expressionists that were working primarily at the time. This sort of the idea of flatness and getting away from all representation. How much that drove shows and drove artists to make the work that they were making.
Well, Greenberg had been writing since I think it was the late 20s, early 30s. He was probably one of the first art critics in America who wrote with a kind of consistent point of view. even if the point of view was not always what one would like or hope to think. But he did have a rigor, even though it was very exclusionary in many ways. And Greenberg knew most of these artists, obviously, very well. He would visit them. And actually, Lee Krasner tells many a story about Clement Greenberg and overhearing him kind of coaching Pollock on the side. And there's a famous story of Clement Greenberg talking to the sculptor David Smith. And David Smith, toward the end of his career, started painting his sculptures after making these sculptures, which were very highly polished steel sculptures that were ground down. And he loved those sculptures. And then Smith started painting them. And evidently, at one point, he actually chipped the paint off one of David Smith's sculptures to show him that, in fact, that it was much better without the paint on it. So I think that, he was... I think the best thing that could be said about him besides the rigor is he actually forced a really good conversation and actually forced people to rebel against him. So I think that was probably one of his most important. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, all the internal plants here. I like this. This is all my fellow fellows.
But we didn't agree on an order. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam, also for just some great pictures. I'm not going to claim that I remember in detail what Serge Guilbeault wrote in that book that you quoted, but I seem to remember that its main take is ideological, and that is a Cold War moment. And I just wondered whether you can also tell your story through that lens. In other words, are the people who are missing, are they also missing for Cold War reasons? Racism seems to be one that's driving it, but are there other, and the money, I think Guilbeault talks about the money also, like where it flows from.
He talks a lot about how the relationship of museums and the State Department actually generated a lot of support for abstract painting, especially because it could be seen to be the great thing about abstract painting is you can lay whatever ideology on it that you want. And that's why Guston didn't end up being shown in a lot of those shows, because his work eventually became very political. But that story has been told very well by Guilbeault, and actually that story has been repeated by many, many art historians. And it's a great book and actually a very, very good read, so I'd encourage you to read it if you haven't.
Adam, that was a great talk, and the question I have for you is there a particular painting that you've shown us this evening that you acquired for the Whitney or another museum?
You've exceeded your vision here. I'm sorry. No, sorry, Jim. What is there what?
That you're particularly proud of having acquired. Is there a particular painting from this tradition that... I would say actually the Clark, and we got Clark. It's interesting. Starting from about the 1970s, 80s, the Whitney really acquired actually a lot of works by African-American artists. And actually they did earlier, but they were mostly artists. It's a long story, but the Whitney's actually sympathies were with non-abstract artists for the longest time. In fact, Barnett Newman, they were very late to acquire as an artist as well. So actually there's a fairly strong representation of black kind of figurative artists, like Bearden, for example. But when it came to the abstract artists, and particularly artists of color and women, we acquired quite a few works at the time, which, by Clark. We actually had Hedda Sterne's work. We acquired additional works. I think the most important thing, for me about it, Jim, is that, as the museum or a museum, but I like to think the Museum of American Art, people go there and expect that it's sort of like the photograph of the Irascibles. They expect that it is telling the story, not a story, but the story of American art, which actually we do everything to fight against by telling multiple stories and contradictory stories. And I think what was most important to me during my tenure was that I felt that while we would never ever do anything on some, kind of statistical basis or anything, but if there were not works that many, many, many cultures and people could come in and recognize themselves. I mean, I remember as a youngster in the 60s going to a museum with my father, and I remember my father, who grew up in a fairly parochial Jewish background, and I remember him walking through and pointing at Rothko and said, he's Jewish. And it's like, and it's that sense of pride. Imagine going to a museum and not having a single painting by a black artist or a Latin American artist or an Asian artist in it. It's like, is it my culture doesn't exist? And you have to remember, as I'm speaking to you as an American, but as an American, this is, a country that has been teeming with other cultures. New York has over 250 languages spoken. To have not, a kind of real breadth was a shame. And so we worked very, very hard, both on the exhibition side, the collection side, the catalog side, to really open it up. And it was something that was started, I have to say, 30, 40 years ago. But we pushed extra hard on that. And so I'd say I'm proud of that more than any particular acquisition.
Thank you, Adam, for your lecture, also to narrate a social history of the Artists Network. I really appreciate that. And it connects to what was said before. Can you share with your experience also being the director of the Whitney Museum and really inside of the system?
Former.
Now former, but you also started your really beautiful elaboration. Now you have the time to re-encounter art, as if, this is now an art history discover, which seemingly is needed. But can you narrate from your experience of running this institution certain key moments where you realized the limits to address a profoundly racialized art system in the US? You just said, why hasn't it been shown in this institution? And certain.
I could give you many examples.
Yeah,
of that.
but I think
and
it's
very,
also
and actually they're pretty painful, I have to say. Because, for example, in trying to increase the number, and by the way, it was not just African American, it was Latin American, it was indigenous artists. Actually, we did pretty well, but it was interesting, and I've written a little bit about it, that the whole thinking about Native American and indigenous artists. The Whitney Museum was really focused on the European tradition, and it considered basically indigenous art something that should be shown at the Museum of Natural History or the Native, and the Whitney actually collected very, very little there until relatively recently, and we did have to play catch up in a lot of these areas. And then I remember going to acquisition committee meetings where you would have not. A lot of people, some people say, are we not going to see art, work by white people anymore? Are we not going to, why are you presenting so much? And it was not a lot of people, and there were probably some people who felt that way but didn't say it. But, that resistance was there. And there were, black curators who I think felt that they weren't always being as fully supported in that way, from, a larger group. And by the way, I think the Whitney is far more open and far more than most museums. But, it's deeply ingrained in the histories. And, that's why, for me, the whole image of the Irascibles and the idea that was what's being shown as the key image in the Rothko show only 3 months ago, that is, that becomes the image of what it should be. And you see those images over and over again; they become ingrained in you, and and any habit is like that. Any habit of exhibition doing, your staffing, your board, etc. So it's important to kind of get some elbow room.
Maybe a moment when it changed, when the key moments when you understood things are really changing. Maybe that's a better question.
I think there's not like a single turning point. I mean, it's these things are a very long, slow process. Building an institution, it's called building because you do it a brick at a time. And actually, I think somebody else talked about a brick at a time. Heidi, you did, didn't you? It's the same idea. It's the brick at a time. Excuse me. And there's a little side one of our fellows talked about, but it's about doing it piece by piece. You have to do the work. History is built, culture is built, and there are flashpoints. There were flashpoints where there were protests, there were this and that. But, there's the famous Dana Schutz protest at the Whitney, which I could take too long to go into. I'll do it in another talk in Dresden. There wasn't a single moment. Even those flashpoints were not, those are the visible moments, but they're not the moments that actually make the change. I mean, I'm a great believer in the radical middle. I think you have to work hard from inside to make these changes, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have pressures from the outside. I mean, we specialized in it. I used to say the Whitney never met a protest it didn't like. And it wasn't that we were looking for the protest, but if you're doing art in real time, you can't help it because you are doing it while it's happening. So. Anyway, it's a long answer, a long conversation.
Adam, I'm back.
Yeah.
I have two questions for you. First is it in some way not remarkable that the thing that came so close to defining the canon of abstract expressionists was a picture in the in the definitive middlebrow publication of mid-century America?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting that there weren't other influences that might have mitigated that. And relatedly, you talked about the irascibles as being, tough-minded, progressive guys who were going to, maybe change the world in one way or another. Did any of them ever speak up on behalf of other artists who were not in the picture?
I think de Kooning did. I mean, it's a very good question, and I actually have not actually gone through the literature, but it'd be really good. I believe de Kooning did on multiple occasions, interestingly. I never heard, in all the biographies I've read of Pollock, I think Pollock seemed to have one interest, and that was Pollock, And Pollock was the most influential, and, Pollock, had his own issues, obviously, so I don't mean to just dump on Pollock, but it actually would be a very good thing to look at because, the whole idea of allyship, which is really, a critical thing. Who were the allies there? And there were some, but I think it was mostly not other painters. I think there were people I think it tended to be writers more than it was artists.
And on the Life magazine question?
It makes total sense. This was the magazine that all of us in the 1950s, at least in the white world, were reading, all the time. It was on everybody's living room. It was table. And, this was the thing that sort of established progressive, but, and pictorially, because it was done through pictures primarily, status quos in a way. And, there was right there, the irascibles opposite, photograph of detergent, American Life.
Hi, Adam.
Not a very good answer, sorry.
Hi, Adam. My name is Melania. I'm a scientist. And in science, we have a similar image that is iconic and that shows 29 scientists, among them Heisenberg and Schrödinger, Planck and Einstein. And the only woman is Marie Curie. And this is an image from a conference in Solvay in 1927. So I was wondering if you have ever considered, or anybody has ever considered, comparing such similar images and having a dialogue between what was happening and who was being defined as a genius in science and what was happening in the art.
Well, I don't know about science per se, but it was very funny. After I did this lecture, somebody sent me a book, and it's called something like to the effect of The Only Woman in the Picture. And it is a whole book of famous photographs with only one woman in the picture. I mean, just like 100 photographs from every field. And my guess is that picture is in there. But you could track it down. It's pretty shocking.
Thank you, Adam. I'm Jean-Luc. Thank you for your scholarship and your candor. This was absolutely blew my mind with images that I had not seen before that helped me put some things together. And I think it was really good that Clement Greenberg was essentially out of your presentation this evening. And yet, when it was brought up by one of your colleagues here, it brought up to mind a couple of questions. Though I earlier had a question that I guess I should drop, which is, how did Joan Mitchell have a music career and paint at the same time? But
I have no idea.
I don't know.
I'm going to ask you for the answer.
But with the Clement Greenberg thing, it made me think about gossip. And given the level of candor of what you revealed to us this evening, I know from recent scholarship of the last 15 years or so that there are stories, biographies, etc., related to the partners and the switching of partners and the erotic, may I be so bold, the erotic milieu that exists amongst these painters, most probably not homosexual by any means, and yet I know that it comes into play, when you present correctly, I think, reminding us that Lee Krasner is constantly labeled as Mrs. Jackson Pollock. I mean, I cringe because it's very much part of the reality of that time. But I remember more than 25 or 30 years ago working with you on one of the Edward Hopper things, and his partner and wife was so critical to his success. So in between all of these people, their partners and their switching partners, could you entertain us with your wonderful candor for some gossip?
Well, I have to admit, that's not a question I expected to get tonight. Ooh, I'm trying to think. I think I'll have to answer that one afterwards. But no, I mean, I don't know. It just started to make me think about, Lorraine and I went to the Pollock Krasner house just like a month or so. I was writing an essay on Lee Krasner's small image paintings, and I wanted to see the bedroom that she had painted them in because it's interesting. What I didn't say is that Pollock actually had used that as a studio initially until he did the barn. So, but I don't know that I really have any gossip. But the thing I'm really struck by, first of all, is that Lee really was deeply in love with Pollock and really supported him and really, believed in him. And I actually suspect he felt somewhat the same about her, and in terms of supporting her in her work. They had a very respectful relationship, and they talked a lot about art together. They also fought and drank and everything else. But I think there are lots of the juicy stories, but the things I'm actually sort of amazed by is the kind of the strength of some of these relationships in spite of all the other stuff that went on, because there was all kinds of, wife swapping and partner swapping and all kinds of things. Maybe I'll come up with a good one by the time we have a drink. Anyway, I think time for maybe one more? Okay.
I could think of another handicap.
Just a second. I'll do it.
Oh, sorry. They're going to give you a microphone. Sorry.
I wonder whether there's another possibility of not getting into such a group if you have a double career and just don't have time to hang around with your artist colleagues. We talked about Alcoplay, and if you think of Caillebotte, I mean, he designed boats and used them, and also if you have money either from earning or being rich and don't need to sell paintings, so you don't sweeten up the galleries and so on. So
True.
Maybe that.
It's
and
true.
also you mentioned the Kooning, open and supportive. He was a friend of Alcoplay. I don't know of the others.
I'd almost rather hear from some of the artists who are here today, but I'm not going to ask them. I'm not going to point them out. But I think artists are, from what I can see, are now so much more supportive of each other than they were 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, I think that there was a competitiveness, and it's not that artists aren't still competitive, but I see so many.
when I want to go to visit artist studios, I often go to artists and say, who should, and they tend to recommend people all the time. And I know even with some of the older artists, and I knew a lot of the artists, not of that generation, but of the pop art generation, and a lot of them were not quite so generous. And I would ask them who I should look at, and they wouldn't necessarily. And I think I think they were brought up to think it was a competition, and they thought that. So I think that's one part of it. And I really do think it has qualitatively changed. And of course, there are always people who are generous going back historically. I don't want to make it sound like it's either or. But I think today, I find that artists tend to be incredibly much more generous to one another than they did when I first entered the field. That's just, an observation. In terms of second careers, there are a lot of artists who are able to succeed because of and even in spite of second careers. But it's not easy to have multiple careers, especially if that other career is not in the arts, and it takes a high level of work and skill.
And in this group, were there any who had a second career?
Robert Motherwell, in a way, but Robert Motherwell was really as much of a writer and a critic as he was really a painter, and I would say he might have been a better writer in some ways than he was a painter, maybe, or equally good, I would say. No, I'm just trying. I'd have to go through my pictures again and look at them one by one, but I don't think any of the others. I think all of them. The art was the thing, and that was part of the whole thing of abstract expressionism, is that you devote your entire life to the challenges of having a family or the career, because I remember the wife of Richard Pousset Dart, who was the youngest abstract expressionist, is somebody who became a really good friend. Actually, she's still around at 102, and she said, Richard Pousset Dart was really one of the only members of the group who grew up with a very strong artist father and a strong artist grandfather. And they actually moved out of the city and raised their two children about 45 minutes from New York. He did not go to the bars at night. And Evelyn Pousset Dart kept saying, he was sort of always on the outside because he wasn't hanging out at the bar, and he was actually spending time with his kids. And he didn't have this big thing about having to prove he was an artist because he had grown up with artists his whole life. So, most of the other artists, I can't think of any of them who grew up who wasn't the first generation artist. So there's a lot of different variations. So one last one. From an artist. That's scary.
What about the primacy of painting in all this? That's an exclusivity in itself as well, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Primacy of painting in what sense, Tessa?
Well, just like, you're talking about why some individuals might not be in the photograph, but it's all about...
primacy of painting vis-a-vis other media. Yeah. Definitely. There are obviously, groups of artists, or not groups, there are a number of sculptors who were identified as abstract expressionists, but that was also Clement Greenberg. Clement Greenberg was always talking, as RJ was saying, about, two-dimensionality and flatness. And so I think there was a real, I would say, a bit of a prejudice against sculpture, number one. I would say there were photographers who were working in a kind of similar mode, people like Aaron Siskin, for example, who was actually sort of loosely associated with the New York School. There were filmmakers who were working in that zone. And, painting was... it was market, I'm sure, to a great degree.
It's more than that, though, isn't it, with painting?
More than that.
It's just like if you do painting plus, you're already, on the fringes.
Yes.
It's...
Yeah, but that goes to her question. If you're...
No, that connects to her question.
Yes, absolutely, because, my instinct about this is that the idea of being an abstract expressionist painter was that you devoted your life singly and solely to that action. And when you think about it, even just Pollock's physical, if you've ever seen any of the films of Pollock painting, and again, the whole thing of the physical way in which he throws himself into that, to me, is exemplary of the fact that it is all about the action, the painting. It is about painting, as if the body is the brush. And I think that, I think that they kind of just edged out anybody who was not single-minded. It was about creating a brand to a degree too. And it's the first time that there was a real market for artists where they could actually start to afford to live. And it was just starting. I mean, Pollock was dirt poor for the most of his life. Rothko did a bit better, but I think that, to have a gallery and to make a living, I mean, for them was a big deal.
Which connects to the collegiality, of course, because there's fewer galleries. And
exactly, and less money. Exactly. No, there are a lot of different reasons for it. I don't mean to say it's just by temperament. There are a lot of different reasons. Absolutely. Are contemporary artists more collegial?
Possibly, but there's a lot more of a market out there, so we can afford to.
See, I'm too upbeat and happy and positive. That's why Dan's taking me away now.